So one criticism I've been seeing for Season 7 of Diablo 4 is that the Witchcraft powers are just rehashed versions of the Vampiric powers from Season 2. And I think that's completely wrong. And first off, the Vampiric powers from Season 2 were incredibly fun. That was still one of my favorite seasons, and that's before all of the really good overhauls to the game. But the Witchcraft powers are actually substantially more interesting, and I think one part of these powers can actually be used on things going forward because they're actually so much more interesting and actually change up how these powers work. So at a baseline, when looking at any of the Witchcraft powers, you get a base power that gives you the base effect of whatever that power does. And then as you're ranking up that power, it improves that effect. And then once you get to the max rank of that power, it gives another effect that generally changes up the entirety of that power. Now it works a little bit differently depending on what type of powers you're using. You have your one unique power you can have equipped. Then you can also have 5 of the minor powers. Now let's just take a look at some of the unique powers. Let's take a look at Piranha, because the developers that show this off, it's probably going to be pretty heavily used. It seems really cool, looks really cool, but seems pretty good in general. So this reads that when an enemy is affected by both a hex and an aura effect from your other Witchcraft powers, a Piranha is summoned, pulling enemies towards it and dealing some amount of physical damage over 12 seconds. May occur once every 20 seconds. But then once you get it to rank 5, so once you max it out, the Piranha will now move itself towards nearby enemies, and I think upgrading this will also allow you to have it out 100% of the time as well. Even though that's kind of just an upgrade to the skill, that completely changes how this power actually works or how you would be using it, because it goes from being this thing you summon that pulls things towards it to that area but just sits there, to now it's a thing that's following you around, pulling stuff to it while constantly following and chasing around enemies. So you're actually going to use this in a completely different way once it's at rank 5. And for certain builds, especially much faster builds, maybe you're teleporting around the map, you may actually need this at rank 5 to really get the best use out of it. But even going into some of the more minor powers, it also gets really interesting as well. So let's take a look at Abyssal Resonance. And this reads, every 250 resource spent, release an explosion dealing some amount of shadow damage. Each explosion triggered within 10 seconds of the last increases the size and damage by 130%, stacking up 3 times. So if you're a build that's using a lot of your main resource constantly, regenning a lot, using a lot, you'll be able to proc this a lot. But then if you get it to rank 10 maxed out, the 3rd explosion pulls enemies towards you before detonating. Now this completely changes up how this skill works, because this changes this power from basically just being additional damage you get from spending a lot of resources to now being a really big damage moment, pulls everything together, and is something you can more control to get the most out of it. Because now you can just control the most juiced up part of this explosion, and also has a pull with it, which is going to make it incredibly strong. This basically completely changes up how you would actually be using this skill, and it may actually want you to not spam your abilities and spam your resource spent as much. You may want to actually control that a little bit more to get that pull, to get that big explosion when you want it. Maybe you would hold off on using your last core skill to get the last explosion to wait for, say, your ultimate proc to get a big damage boost, then use it, pull everything together, get that massive explosion, and do a lot more damage than you would have before. And another power we have is Aura of Siphoning. This conjures an aura of decay that deals some amount of poison damage to enemies every second, but once you get up to rank 10, each time Aura of Siphoning deals damage, you are healed for 1% of your max life. Now this may seem like it's just kind of an upgrade to the skill and now it gives some healing, but this could completely change up how you're actually using this, and can also change up other parts of your build. Because once you get this to rank 10, you will probably be able to remove other pieces of healing from your build. It also really depends on how this aura can be affected by other parts of builds. Like I could definitely see a world where this poison is somehow affected by other effects that maybe increases the speed at which your poison effects deal their damage or something, and could affect the speed at which this heals. But this changes this from being something you just kind of use to apply poison to now something that may change up how you're playing. Because maybe you were more of a ranged build and you wanted to stay maybe at the edge of this aura to poison things for extra damage, damage or to apply other effects. But now because this is healing you so much, this may make you actually want to just be in melee range and hitting as many targets as possible with this aura. And I think this is one of the mech trunk upgrades that changes the skill the least, but it will change how you actually use the skill and potentially how you play. And then another really interesting power is Decay Augmentation. Your Witchcraft effects deal some percentage of the damage dealt over 5 seconds. The damage type is based on your class. Now, even in this first part, the skill is pretty interesting because first off, it's just dealing additional damage, but depending on what element this actually is or what elemental dot this is, this can pretty heavily affect your build or damage in general because there's so many different things that can trigger off of some type of elemental dot. But then getting it up to rank 10 almost completely changes up this skill and is kind of like 2 powers in one. So at rank 10, when your damage over time effects exceed 85% of the target's total life, they immediately die. Now this takes this skill from just being something you would probably use for a little extra damage and primarily to apply some type of elemental effect to now being something that you're probably going to want to use in every damage over time build. Because at rank 10, it also doesn't say that it has to be some specific type of damage over time. This is just any damage over time effect from everything, and executes are generally really strong. So this is kind of like 2 different powers put into one, and getting up to rank 10 not only completely changes how this power works, but it also changes what builds you would want to use this power on. Because there's definitely going to be some builds that probably wouldn't care about this power until you get it to rank 10. And then it completely changes up what this actually does. And there's a bunch of additional examples because there is a good chunk of overall powers. I think there's a total of 26 now. But the main reason I wanted to go over these powers and how they work is because not only are these pretty interesting and getting the max rank of all of your powers is going to massively change up the build possibilities, but this also ties into the progression system of the season because that's a pretty big part of the season, getting the powers, then upgrading them all. But not only are these powers just interesting, you're going to have a lot of options mixing them all together, then a lot more options when you rank them all up. So you can have some crazy mixes there, but how these interact with the new occult gems is going to be really interesting as well, because some of these occult gems are actually going to force you to make some difficult decisions on what powers you actually want to be using. Because let's say you have 5 different minor powers you really want to use in your build. They're all going to be really good for your build. But then let's say you also want to use the Fiend of the Bog occult gem, which is seeming to be one of the strongest ones. Now what this gem does is while you have 3 or more growth and decay witch powers slotted, you gain 10% primary stat, 10% max life, and you are always unhindered, meaning you can freely move through all enemies. Now this is going to be an incredibly strong gem and probably the strongest or one of the strongest occult gems. But what's really interesting is you need 3 or more growth and decay witch powers slotted. Let's say you have 2 powers that you want to use that's growth and decay, but let's say you have 3 other powers that aren't growth and decay that are 3 powers that are super good for your build. Well, now you have to determine, do you want to switch out one of your powers to use the Fiend of the Bog to get a massively beneficial effect like being unhindered the whole time, not even counting the really good stat increases, but just being unhindered is a really strong. You could potentially have to lose one of your better powers for a lesser power to get this effect. And a lot of the other occult gems work in this way as well. And keep in mind, you can have 3 occult gems on at any time, 1 in both your rings and 1 in your necklace. And you're going to want these occult gems because they also give you armor and all resist, so you're not really losing any defensives. And a lot of these occult gems are kind of built to tie back into your witchcraft powers to really get the most out of those witchcraft powers. And I think the overall effect of this is just going to be a lot more build possibilities and a lot more variations of the same build when you look at the same build from 2 completely different players. They could be using completely different witch powers mixed with completely different occult gems or vice versa, even within the same build or same type of build for that class. So personally, I'm incredibly excited for these new power systems we're getting with this season. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.